Hello, I'm Edith Blanchard, the director of the Charles H. MacNider Museum, and today we're going to talk about Grandma Moses. Grandma Moses is a painter that is very well known. We acquired this piece in our collection several years ago. And since we're kind of talking about some landscapes these weeks, so we thought that it'd be a good idea to talk about her. She primarily painted landscapes. Grandma Moses, also her real name was Anna Mary Robertson Moses, was born in about 1860 in New York State. And as she grew up, her father was a farmer and grew flax. And so after a time, when she was about 12 years old, she went to work as a live-in housekeeper for some of the wealthier families in the neighborhood. And while she was there, she became very much enthralled and interested in a lot of the prints that the family had. Specifically, there were some Currier and Ives prints that the family had, and her employers noticed this. And so what they did was they gave her some chalks and some crayon pencils for her to try to learn to draw. And so she had a little bit of art interest early on. When she was a young child, they didn't have a lot of resources, but she would use what she had, and her father would occasionally buy her paper to draw on, which at that time was kind of like a luxury, to have something such as white paper, if you can think about that. So she would oftentimes even use sawdust and charcoal and all things like that to form her paintings, because she didn't have the option of going to Hobby Lobby or Joann Fabrics or Dick Blick art materials and purchasing specific art supplies. So as she grew, she, as I mentioned, was interested in art, but she really didn't have time to do it as she was working full time. And eventually she married and had a family of her own, and they had a farm, and she would sell butter and things like that. And so with all this going on, she really didn't have time to pursue any sort of interest in art, although she appreciated it. So Grandma Moses, as an older person living with her daughter, really liked to do embroidery work. The embroidery was something that she was able to do now that she was semi-retired. She made landscapes using the embroidery thread and floss and gave them to her friends and family members. But after a while, her arthritis was so bad that she was no longer able to grasp the tiny needle that is an embroidery needle. And so her family members gave her painting supplies. And although still it's a little bit thin, a paintbrush is still easier for her to hold at this time. So she begins painting, and she really doesn't have any formal schooling. So at the start, she paints a lot of things that she sees. She replicates a lot of drawings and works of art that she knows about. And eventually she starts painting really her own creations. She paints the landscapes, the people around her. Very much her artworks have a New England feel because she was living in New England during this time period. And a lot of these pieces really harken back to her childhood. Remember, at this time, it's probably the late 1930s, and she was born in 1860, before the Civil War. So if you think about it, that there's this huge time span in which she's trying to recreate those images. When she's painting, she takes out and doesn't put in any modern cars, telephone poles, anything that would be considered modern. Once again, really drawing on her childhood. So she was discovered because someone from New York City, who was an engineer and a collector of art, came to the town that she was living in and saw her works of art for sale for $15 a piece in the general store. He bought every single one of them and then went to her home and bought more. And he took these back to New York City and then really worked over the next few years to help her become a recognized artist. And within a year, she was having her work shown in major museums. When you look at her work, it looks extremely simplistic. And that's probably true to us that might be more trained in looking and seeing a more formal work of art. But she has her own style and her own technique. When you look at it closely, the horse's legs aren't necessarily proportional to the horse's bodies, but that's not what's important. What's important with this is that she's storytelling in this. This is called Going Home from Church, and this is a very typical scene of what she would have done. A lot of winter scenes with those classic New England items such as the red barns and the hills and the churches. And there's a group here that are on sleds returning home. A lot of detail for even as small as her work of art is. And once again, as I mentioned, she painted these on masonite boards. So she was kind of at that point, she was making them rather small, not doing really, really large works of art. One of the interesting things about the piece that we have here at the museum is that with some of her works, she would include glitter in the snow. And if you think about it, that's extremely unusual and very unorthodox for a normal painter to put glitter in the snow. But when the museum collected this piece, we very much wanted to have one of the pieces that had that element. And so you can see, probably not on camera very well, but there is glitter that is in the snow and the paint after she painted it. I like to use this as a storytelling exercise for the kids. If you were today to look out your window, what would you paint as a landscape? And that's what Grandma Moses was doing, was looking out her window and painting this as a landscape, but also she was taking memories from her childhood. So if you think about creating a landscape, what are places that you've been or places that you've seen on television or read about in a book? What are things that you could draw as a landscape using just your imagination and not necessarily what's in front of you? So a lot of artists have done that, and what she did was kind of time travel in her imagination, and you can do that as well when you're working on your landscape drawing. So Grandma Moses went on to become sort of a celebrity in her time period. She died in 1961 at 101 years old, but before her death, she wrote a book about her life's experience. She also was on the cover of all sorts of major magazines and interviewed, and really went from being a simple farm wife and a domestic servant, if you will, to somebody who was a national celebrity who didn't even start painting until their late 70s. This is also a really good example that it doesn't matter how old you are, we want you to participate in our art challenges.